Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Spiritual Wanderlust podcast. My name is Kelly Deutsch, and today I am joined by Kathy Henderson Staudt. And I feel like the timing couldn't be better. We're in the middle of the Women Mystic School, offering masterclasses on everything contemplative, feminine, embodied, mystical. But we're also gearing up for our next series on Celtic spirituality, which is a rich path to a lot of similar themes. Ritual and rhythm, thin spaces, their sense of wanderlust, and that vision of the world where every season and song and sparrow is sacred. And Kathy shares a lot in common with both of these streams. She's a poet, retreat leader, teacher, and spiritual director in the Washington, D.C. area. In her writing and her scholarship, she's most interested in how we embrace and experience our lives as creatures with bodies, seeking to be in whole and loving relationships with one another and with the mystery at the heart of our lives and of the cosmos. Her poetry is a spiritual practice, enabling her to dwell deeply in the richness and challenges of life, loss, relationships, and transitions. So, right up our alley here at Spiritual Wanderlust, where we love talking about wholeness and liminal spaces and spiritual practice. So I've been looking forward to our conversation today. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you, Kelly.
Absolutely. To start us off today, I'd love to hear a bit about your background. And you can answer this in whatever way you want, but what roads led you to where you are today as poet, spiritual director, teacher, and all of the many and varied things you do?
Yeah. I don't think I would have expected to wind up as a poet and spiritual teacher when I started out. I was very much, the smartest girl in the class, very academic, very drawn to the life of the mind. I was raised in a family. I was really fortunate in this. I was raised in a kind of liberal Protestant Presbyterian family. And we talked about theology at the dinner table, but in a kind of open-minded way, because my parents were from different theological backgrounds and they were kind of learning themselves. One thing you can see that's true about our family is my sisters and I ended up in 3 different denominations, but all still very much practicing some kind of spiritual path. And I think I had a very lively inner life from a very early age, but no language or model to know what this was. And so I think it's one of the things I think I have in common with Evelyn Underhill. I think my scholarly work was partly trying to figure that out. Where is there some language that's not theological language that talks about this? So I got very interested in the Romantic poets. My undergraduate thesis, when I look back at it now, when you ask what's the path you've been on, my undergraduate thesis was on the image of the veil, veil, in Romantic poetry, the thing that both hides and reveals. And in 2 different poets, Shelley and the French poet Arthur Rimbaud. And then I went on and did a PhD in comparative literature, again, because that exposed me to a bunch of different cultures and different languages. I have a couple of foreign languages that I speak and read pretty fluently. And, the idea that there's something real here that transcends language, I think has always been something I've believed, but you also kind of need language to anchor it. And I'm a word person. So my graduate thesis was called The Problem of Transcendence. And I looked at an atheist poet, the Romantic Percy Bysshe Shelley, and a French symbolist, Stéphane Mallarmé, who talked about words as things in a work of art. And then I discovered in graduate school this Anglo-Welsh poet named David Jones, who talks about art and poetry as sacramental activities. And he was both a visual artist and to me, absolutely fascinating modernist poet. And his poetry is very difficult, but I read he has a long poem where the central image is the celebration of Eucharist in the middle of World War II. And and there's a lot more to it, but I was drawn into that poem the first time I read it. It's called The Anathemata. by David Jones, and wound up writing a chapter on Jones in my doctoral dissertation, and then eventually, but there's a whole story between then and then, a book on David Jones. So he's been, and he continues to be kind of my scholarly and artistic companion, but also he was a World War I veteran who was horribly traumatized by the war, and a Catholic convert, like many in the 1920s who became Catholics in the aftermath of the war, who just found in the kind of long Western spiritual tradition, especially Celtic spirituality, that something real, that for him was very much expressed in the liturgies of the church. And at the time I discovered him, I was also discovering the Episcopal Church's expression of Christianity, which includes a lot more sacramental practice than what I was raised with, and I loved it. And so that's why I became an Episcopalian. My Presbyterian sister says it was my adolescent rebellion. And so it's been in the Episcopal Church starting from, I was confirmed in the Episcopal Church my senior year in college. I never really wandered very far from a Christian expression of some kind, but there was just a lot that was new to me. I didn't know anything about the mystics. And then of course life adventures happened, right? I think the next real turning in my path, I kind of started out with plan A, got a couple of academic jobs, followed my husband through medical school and postdoc. And while he was doing his postdoc, I had an NEH grant to work on the David Jones book. It was all kind of going along swimmingly. And then I had this experience just about when it looked like we were out in a different city when he was doing his postdoc, and I was on leave from my teaching job in Philadelphia. And just as we were about to go back to plan A, I just had this epiphany. I remember vividly my little 3-year-old, 2.5-year-old was sitting in his high chair messing with his Cheerios, and my husband had gone for an interview for the job that would allow us to be both in the same city and doing what we planned to do. And he called me and the phone rang. And I call this my Annunciation story. The phone rang. It was my husband saying, "It's on, we can do it." And I suddenly realized I didn't want to go back to an academic teaching job. I still wanted to write my book. But the work of the life of motherhood has turned out to feel more like a vocation than I had realized. And I couldn't see how it all was going to go together. And it just it was one of those moments. It's not always like that for me with discernment, but it was just clear. And so everything else has sort of followed from that. So we had another child and moved to Washington, D.C. area following my husband's career, found a church after much searching. And really just about after we found that church, and it was, a place where I felt welcome and our kids felt welcome, I was diagnosed with very early stage breast cancer. And I was in my late 30s with 2 kids under 5. And it turned out fine. As you can see, I'm still here over 30 years later, but it shook me to the core. It was just a discovery that anything can happen anytime. And I didn't know for a while how serious it was going to turn out to be. And navigating everyone else's reactions to that, realizing how many lives kind of depended on mine. I was very blessed in having a very supportive community of other moms in the neighborhood and of friends at church, and particularly a pastor who kind of saw where I was. And I remember telling him, when I told him, it was like you were supposed to keep it a secret, this breast cancer diagnosis. I don't know. It's sort of a way I think we maintain control when there's bad health news. You sort of decide who you're going to tell. And partly because you just don't want to deal with everybody else's reaction, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But so I remember a conversation with my priest, who was a guy about my age with kids about my age, so probably shook him up too. And I said, I feel like I've been on a really good spiritual path. I've been on a plateau, and I'm not sure I'm ready for a valley. And he said, I think it's called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. So kind of working out I kind of went through the whole experience. I got a mastectomy. I had, dealing with that loss, all kinds of things to deal with, and really didn't face the fact that I was still kind of shook up by all of this after everybody else had moved on, because, margins were good. I didn't have to do any further treatment. It was all good. I was cured, it's over. Only then did I start processing what had happened for me. And what really helped me was the liturgies of Holy Week, the Way of the Cross, just going through the next cycle, that story of Christ. I kind of thought about Maundy Thursday, and I remembered my neighborhood friends giving me a party right before I went into the hospital. And I thought about Good Friday and the kind of the loneliness of the hospital room, and kind of walked through the whole thing to Easter. And that really was a turning. And in the course of that, began to have a number of really vivid experiences of the love of God for me, the presence of God in my life, and to write them down in my journal. I started keeping a journal regularly, and something started coming out that I realized was poetry. Now, you have to understand, I was trained as an academic reading poetry, so to let myself write poetry,
different muscle,
to spend that critical thing was a big step. So for a long time, it was very private, very much just something between me and God, and maybe I would share it. I have a few friends who would listen, especially when we went to the beach in the summer. My friends at the beach house would listen to what I was writing as I was walking along the waves. But it took a while to really own the poetry I was writing. And meanwhile, I was kind of carving out a vocational path that involved more retreat work. I had a friend who taught at a seminary, and they let me teach a course on religion and on literature and theology. And so I found myself teaching at seminaries, learning from my seminary colleagues, kind of getting excited about theological things again, and trying to put all of that together. And I guess the other thing that happened was I finished the David Jones book right before I went for my surgery. That was very clear to me that I had to finish that manuscript and get it off. And the published, the box with the published copies of it arrived on my doorstep on Good Friday.
Interesting.
Which was very cool.
Yeah.
So many years later, 10 years after I'd started the book. So that intertwining of the life of the mind and the life of the spirit, I think gradually finding the courage to write poetry developed alongside owning the life of prayer, finding that people were coming to me for spiritual advice, and maybe I needed to get some training about how to offer that. And I would say now my primary vocation is as a spiritual director and spiritual companion and retreat leader, but that the poetry and the spiritual guidance come from the same place.
I was going to say that's such a rich intersection point, and that way of viewing the world, kind of that sacramental imagination where everything means something, is, I think that's, if there was a Venn diagram between poets and contemplatives, that's one of the key things that's shared in common. And so, I was thinking earlier how, most kids don't get into poetry at a young age. Like, it's not super common, but the poetic mind and imagination, that way of, I just think of the times when I would get home, I was like 8, and we'd get off the bus and the I lived in the South Dakota countryside, and I just like lie in the grass and soak up the clouds. I don't really think about anything in particular, and that I think is that predisposition that a lot of us have to that poetic or contemplative way of life, of recognizing the depths that are there without yet knowing how to put it into words.
Yeah, I think I was probably 8 or 10 when I wrote home from Girl Scout camp about a moment when there was this bright purple flower in the meadow, and it just blew me away. And I remember my dad writing back and saying, "Thank you for sharing that with us." And it was, clear to me that he got that this was something important about me. And later, of course, I read Alice Walker, who said, if I think it pisses God off if we walk by the color purple in the field and don't notice. So I think that's, you're right. There are many of us who have that contemplative disposition, but we're not really encouraged to develop it.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's fantasy. You're supposed to be learning the difference between reality and, fantasy. Of course, Underhill talks about mysticism as the art of union with reality. So that doesn't quite fly, does it? But yeah, I think certainly in my case that, it was about, finding a understandable purpose in life and succeeding in school and succeeding at the tasks that were put before us. So I don't know that that's everybody's experience. I think some kids are encouraged to follow their artistic bent. But the other thing is, sometimes there's kind of a culture of you have to be good at the best at something if you do it at all. And the contemplative experience doesn't really, it's not something you can be good at, it's just someone you are.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that whole idea of, we're expected to be like productive and in a very certain kind of way, maybe more the capitalistic Western mindset versus that kind of fantasy. I almost think of it as looking at the world with like a wink. There's like this sense of mischief, and you read that in a lot of kind of the Celtic tradition. I love that about them, that there was just so much vivacity around them. That's something that Hildegard would talk about, the viriditas, the greenness,
Right. Well, and that viriditas is actually the working title of my forthcoming book of poems.
I love it.
So that, yes, exactly, that green life that pulses through everything, that the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas calls it the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. So yeah, I think, and perhaps more and more as we're paying more attention to the earth, this is something that we will recapture, and it's something the Celtic tradition did not lose.
Yeah, I'm curious how you would recommend, like, how do we recapture that when we get so, whether people listening are, busy with like 3 kids and jobs and running errands, or they're retired and have just, lived a certain way and are just kind of used to their path. How do we help encourage that kind of sacramental imagination, the Celtic vision, the poetic vision that sees life and notices the purple in the field? And I loved your poem on the 17-year cicadas, and like you called it their treetop wedding song, and they harmonize and whistle, wow, 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 wow. And I loved that, because how often do we just like go to bed and like, oh my gosh, the cicadas, could they just shut up so I can sleep?
Right.
Like,
well, and when when this Brood 10 comes back, it's all the news media is all about how annoying it is, And so that was kind of a countercultural poem, because I was loving it. So I think that, to answer your thought, I think the word noticing is really important. Annie Dillard says we're here to notice. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Or maybe it's Lucille. Poets say that. They all say it. Notice, pay attention. But you can do it, when you're walking by. You can do it. There's a way of nature journaling I ran across where you just write in your journal, I notice, I see, I notice, I wonder.
Hmm.
That may not be what I learned, but that's how I do it. I see, so what do I see? What am I noticing about what I see? What do I wonder?
Hmm.
And that gives kind of space. But I think when I used to be in the midst of the crazy of raising kids, when I used to turn off the radio when I drove through Rock Creek Park, just so I still do that. When I'm driving to Virginia, I turn off the radio on George Washington Parkway where the trees are beautiful, just to let it kind of flow over me. I think walking outdoors also is just the thing to do if you can, and to have something green around you, even if you're in an urban setting. All of those things, and to read poets, read poetry. Mary Oliver, a lot of people are reading Mary Oliver now because she's so tuned in to this quality of the life around us. But I think a lot of contemporary poets are that's where we get our energy, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think of the practice of taking a Sabbath, whether it's like a media Sabbath or, like whatever kind of just moment of pause and stillness. And it might be 10 minutes throughout your day where you just allow yourself to sit on the couch and look out the window,
Right.
or
yeah,
it's almost like what we do when we daydream,
it really doesn't have to be more than 5 or 10 minutes. It's practicing the presence, right? It's just it's letting what's real get back in the middle of crazy. And of course with kids, taking the kids to the park, and kids help with this actually, if you can see it from their point of view. And that it can be a wonderful time of life. But the way that parenthood is structured, at least in my own social location, is it's very busy.
Talk to me a little bit about poetry as a spiritual practice. I mean, what does that look like for you? Is it all of these things, like it just depends on the day, or is it a certain more formal kind of practice? What does that look like?
So I think it's got for me, it has two levels. One is I do write in a journal almost every day, even if it's just my daily to-do list. And usually part of my journaling is some kind of practice of paying attention to where I am. And I rarely say, okay, I'm going to write a poem now. But what happens is that practice of attention will sometimes just stir and make me feel like there's something here to pay attention to. And sometimes it just comes out as a poem. And I write in my journal in cursive, which means that nobody but me can read it. In fact, I can't even read it myself most of the time. But when something that looks like a poem comes out, I print. So when I go back through my journal, I can see those places where something kind of bubbled up. The other thing I sometimes do is, if it feels like a poem, I'll say, okay, let me just try putting this into a form. Can I write a 14-line unrhymed sonnet that's in iambic pentameter? Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. So just that kind of structure puts pressure on the words so that it kind of distills what's important. Or a tanko, which is kind of an expanded haiku structure, where you write it's 5 lines alternating 5 and 7 syllables, and so that forces you to focus on the image, on the core thing. And then sometimes I'll know it's good when it talks back to me. But I tend to do, I was an academic for so long that I'm still pretty much on a program year schedule. So September to June, I'm doing my spiritual direction appointments and teaching and whatever. And then in the summer, even though I still do some of that, I count on 3 months of Sabbath time. And during the summer, I will often really spend time crafting. So I'll look back through my journals from the previous 9 months and pull out some of these things that I've printed. And then the crafting is, okay, so what's the music here? Is there a form it wants to take? Are there words that need to be taken out? Is there something else going on here? And just kind of working it until it talks back to me. So I often go through and just type up all of these passages in my journals, and most of them aren't keepers, but then reading through and seeing what lands and what feels like a keeper.
Yeah, I love that, because it's so much like the contemplative life. Again, that Venn diagram overlaps so much between the poetic world and that of the contemplative. But it's almost like you're adopting a poetic stance, like this attentiveness. And in the contemplative life, I like to talk of it as like a receptivity, like a Marian stance before reality.
Absolutely.
And then it sounds like actual poems are just the fruit of that. Like,
yes,
it's great if it happens, but it's not like you sit down and you're like, I'm going to write a poem today. Like. Now,
I will say sometimes I've had Lenten discipline of writing a sonnet a day. Sometimes just to get myself, if I haven't been writing in a while, I'll do that. And that's also a discipline of humility, because of course, most of them are terrible.
Sure. That's
but,
a good point.
But it does concentrate the focus, to just decide to do that.
Do you have a favorite poem that you've written?
Well, I'm thinking of our theme. I can read you this poem, which is the last one in my collection, Good Places. I tend to write. I have my first, not the first one, but the next two volumes are chapbooks, which means that I also put quite a lot of thought into what poem goes next to what poem, and there's a kind of arc. There's a kind of story arc if you read through all of the poems. So these were poems that I wrote during the year, actually it was between the year that I was 59 and 60, and we changed, we moved house, we moved from one house to another. So it was leaving behind it was poems from the first house, and then looking ahead to the new house and the new garden and the place we've been here for 10 years now. But it also, it uncovered a very prayerful kind of experience of the world. So the one I was going to read doesn't say too much about the nature part, but I'm going to read it anyway because it's the one I said I was going to read.
Sure.
It's called Reveling, which is another word for the contemplative practice, isn't it? Just to revel. Just to revel. Prayer, Teresa said, will finally be a simple conversation between friends. Beyond the drama and the wilderness, the dry places and the upwelling springs, at last, or intermittently, we settle to daily conversation. That is all. And sometimes, as today, the conversation lapses. Nothing really now to say. And even though the silence might appear to be an invitation into some dramatic mystic moment, it is not exactly that. Rather, a simple reveling. Contentment without content, resting in the quiet being here that long love brings. And that's an example of a sonnet. That's 14 lines. Lovely. And it was this experience that I didn't know how to put into words until I kind of tried the sonnet form. And it lands on, I love the line it lands on. I sometimes use it as a mantra, that pentameter line, the quiet being here that long love brings. Says a lot of it. And that line definitely felt given.
Yeah, the image that comes to mind with that, the quiet being here that long love brings, it makes me think of just long-term relationships. And for some reason, I'm thinking of like aging parents and visiting. And sometimes like there isn't a whole lot to say, there's just a quiet being here together. Like, you've covered probably the big things at some point in time, and you may have talked about the little things like the weather or, what you're having for dinner or something, something simple, but it's the being together that really counts.
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting too that this comes out of a time when I was spending that kind of time with my mother as she was aging. And the new book was written right after she died. Some of the poems in there are written right after she died. So it's been a way of, the poetry has been a way of tracking. The middle volume, Waving Back, was from the period when my kids were when I was sort of seeing that it wasn't going to be long before they were going to be leaving home. So it was a kind of elegiac movement. So it has tracked kind of periods of my life. I think that is the other thing that the poetry does. It's been a way of it's been a kind of memoir, really.
Yeah.
And I'm finding this new volume that will be coming out next year is it will be a new and selected poem. So I've gone back and said, what am I going to keep that kind of tells the story? And there's kind of an arc now that tells my life story in a new way. So
is that the Veritas one?
Veritas, yes.
Beautiful. Yes. Does it have a release date yet?
I have to get the manuscript to the publisher at the end of January. So I would guess next fall. And I'll come back to you when it comes out.
Great. Oh, looking forward to it. One question I wanted to ask you, you talk about embodiment in our bodies, like being creatures who kind of discover that we have bodies. You even have a poem about the first humans kind of discovering their embodiment, if you will. And I'm wondering what that journey of discovery has looked like for you. Like, how would you describe your relationship with your body, especially starting as an academic who I'm sure spent so much time in your mind, like many of us do? How did you become more embodied, and what did that look like?
Oh, wow. When you ask it that way, it's so much, movement out of my head into my body. Some of it was, David Jones as a subject talks a lot about no body, no Christian, no religion, so theologically I had a kind of understanding of that. And I thought it was a neat idea, but it was really the experience of motherhood. So I will tell you a shaggy dog part of that Annunciation story that I wasn't going to tell you, but it's part of it. So I think for me, I was so much on track toward this academic career. I remember people telling me, finish the book before you have the baby. The university where I was teaching didn't even have maternity leave. You had to call it disability. It was like, this was in the early 80s. So, so when I got this grant to go work on my book, it was still an academic credential. I was going to finish the book, but I could follow my husband out of town and have the first baby, right? So, and I think the first thing was just the experience of pregnancy and of childbirth, which was pretty smooth for me the first time. But it uses all of you. And I think I did have we had some difficulty after my son was born with his feeding. So there was all that angst, and I probably had more than a touch of postpartum depression, and we just didn't have framework for that. So my body I was sort of amazed at what my body could do. I remember right after giving birth thinking and taking a shower and thinking, wow, and then of course dealing with all the aftermath of childbirth, which isn't completely pleasant. But then after that, and then of course I had followed my husband to this new community. So it took me a while before I really had much in the way of my own community. So it was that those first few years of my son's life were pretty solitary until I sort of found some people, started a babysitting co-op, but I was very aware of, and I was still trying to write this book. So so my intellectual life was going forward, and now there was this whole new thing, and it was something I'd always wanted, and it was great, but wow. And so then, and part of that Annunciation experience, when when the phone rang and my husband he still says he was amazed at what my response to there was, but it set us all on a path that has been very fruitful. But after that, one of the things that I realized was I didn't want to go back to academia, and I wanted to have another baby. And so here's the shaggy dog and the spiritual part of the story. So I got pregnant almost immediately, and then I had an early miscarriage, which happened on Good Friday.
Oh.
And we were not involved with the church, even though we'd been quite active in a church back in our previous town, but that was a thing we hadn't done. We'd been to church a little bit, but I was very aware that it was Good Friday, and it was my body in tune with the whole story, and in ways I wasn't even putting into words. I mean, it was just too painful, and it was very early. It was like probably 6 weeks, but and again, it was like everybody said, okay, well, move on, it'll be fine. Although you do find out about all your other friends who had miscarriages, that at that time we weren't really talking about it much. So I realized when this baby wasn't going to happen, and we were going to be in this new town for more years than I thought we were going to be, because we didn't have to go back. I realized I better get back to whatever my identity was. So I kind of threw myself into a bunch of academic opportunities and worked harder on the book, and eventually got pregnant again as we were moving. And my daughter was born shortly after we moved to Washington. But by then, that experience of kind of just giving myself to this process of bearing and raising children was an embodied thing, and raising kids is an embodied thing. I mean, I found I loved it. I loved watching. I have another poem about my daughter when she was little, rolling in the sand, well, let me read that one to you, because it kind of gives you that embodied stuff from that time of life. It's called Reality at the Beach. And I've got a bunch of poems about the beach in this one. Here it is. Just now, there is nothing else in all the world except this warm and sifting sand flecked with orange crystal shell shards flowing from this child's blue shovel. Filling her yellow pail, she packs and smooths, digs and dumps. Now she dips her fist into the beach and spills a sand pile on her bent-up knee, watches fascinated as the tingling sandfall flows down her ankles, burying her toes. Around her sounds the steady, solid bass beat of crashing surf against the jutting sandbars, the swimmer's shouts, the seagull's cries, and through it all an offshore breeze blows her hair and cheeks. The child leaps up and rolls across the sand down to the edge of the sea, and squealing leaps into my arms. And there is nothing else in all the world just now except those sandy arms that cling around my neck, this salty hair against my cheek, this scratchy, wriggling body, and her laughter mingling with the sand and the wind and the sea.
I love it. I love there's such a sensuality in the imagery. Like you can feel it and smell it and taste it.
Yeah, actually, as I read it, I thought it's a primer for somebody who's wondering, when you're immersed in the mothering life, or how to get in touch with that embodiment.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I love that motherhood was such a path for that for you, because I feel like that's such a feminine experience, and one of the reasons why that the feminine kind of archetype, if you will, tends to be so embodied, because it's like as a woman, your body is very vocal,
Yes, right.
No, there is a lot going on, I mean, especially with, pregnancy and childbirth and nursing and menstrual cycles and, just all your body is very involved.
And if you're trying to be on a traditionally male career path, at least in my generation, the pressure was really to pretend like all of that wasn't happening, right?
Yeah.
So that and I say my generation, I mean, I graduated from college in the 70s when we thought we had this, but obviously it's still an issue. It's not that different from for my daughter's generation, I think, in some ways. There's more conversation, certainly, about menstruation and miscarriage. And I think and I hope that the way that I talk about motherhood from my experience doesn't get interpreted as the kind of traditional male idealizing, oh, it's going to be wonderful, you'll love it, because the poems are from places in my experience.
Yeah.
And there are also, some of them are poems about loss and leaving and those kinds of things. So, because that's the other thing about child rearing that I realized, is that at every stage of a child's life, there's grieving, because they are now who they are, and that's what you are embracing, but they're not who they were.
Yeah.
And yet you're holding the memory of all of that, and that's a gift to them also, because you've known all of these stages of who they are. And I think it's what we lose when we lose our parents, right? They're the ones who knew that, all of that about us.
Yes.
So I've been very mindful of that. And I think, and then having this diagnosis when I was just getting the hang of this. And then it's like, wait a minute, am I not going to get to see this whole story through? So really every milestone in my children's lives has been a gift. I've always been aware that it could have been otherwise. So
yes, there's nothing like.
So I think I'm probably more intensely able to rejoice in that, perhaps, than if I hadn't had that experience at that time in my life.
That's a good point. Yeah, there's nothing like an experience of your mortality to wake you up to just the preciousness of little moments.
Well, and actually, the other thing is, when you asked how I got started as a poet, the first poems that I published were poems about the cancer experience. So that also, I think, it's another way in which it's prayer, that it helps you to kind of spiritually process the hard things in our embodied life.
Yes.
So
yes. One thing I wanted to ask you about, in the past, you were the president of the Evelyn Underhill Association. Is that correct?
I am the new president.
Oh, you are the new
president.
Association. Okay.
Yes, the founding president is Dana Green, whose biography of Underhill I recommend to everybody. Its title says it all. She's the artist, Evelyn Underhill, the artist of the infinite life.
That sounds great.
Of infinite life. It's great. Everybody should read it. And Dana is the president emerita now. And I first the Evelyn Underhill Association has been around now for 30 years. I think they were started in 1989. It's really just started as a small group of people in the DC area who were devotees of Underhill and friends of Dana's. One of our founders was a lawyer who got us incorporated as a nonprofit. And the main thing that we do is we hold an annual quiet day in honor of Evelyn Underhill. It used to be at the Washington National Cathedral. Now we use a space that's right adjacent to the grounds of the cathedral. It's always on the Saturday near the day when the Episcopal Church honors her as a saint. Her feast, she's in our calendar of saints, and her feast day is June 15th. So Saturday, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm assuming, or at least what I've heard in the past, is Evelyn is kind of the British pronunciation, and a lot of us Americans say Evelyn. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's fine. Either one works.
Okay.
Either one works. And,
tell us a little bit about Evelyn, because I know there are so many people who have never heard of her, but I think she is just I see her as like the Richard Rohr of her day, of making
that is absolutely who she was,
accessible, and she's okay. I'll let you talk. Tell us a little about Evelyn.
Yeah, she was writing. She started out as a really prolific writer of fiction and poetry. and she was really interested just in the spiritual path. Remember, this is the era before the First World War. Very interested in kind of the perennial philosophy and just what the spiritual life was. She had some kind of early conversion from agnosticism, which we don't have any details about because she hardly ever wrote about her own interior life. So, and then she was curious. This is where I have a feeling of finish. She was curious. Something was going on within her, and she just undertook pretty much on her own a study of the Christian mystical tradition and read in depth the Christian mystics and wrote this tome on this large book called Mysticism.
And she wasn't trained primarily as an academic, right? I mean, she was just like, I'm just going to do this on my own. This is 100 years ago.
Her college level stuff was in botany. But it was her own curiosity and her, she obviously was brilliant, able to learn this stuff. And she had, she enlisted people who knew the languages the mystics wrote in if she didn't know them. I mean, she had people helping her, but she put together what is still kind of the starting textbook about mysticism, especially in the Christian tradition. It was published in 1911. And if you know anything about academic publishing, you will know that it is miraculous to say that it has been continually in print ever since it appeared in 1911. And it was, so that was before the war. And after the, and she, so it was after the war that she wrote this book that was published in 1918, which I'll talk about, called Practical Mysticism, a little book for normal people, which kind of distills a basic contemplative practice for what she calls the skeptical practical man. She uses all masculine language. She's very much an Edwardian, but she's living this what must have been an incredibly intense and ardent inner life, while living the life of a upper middle class Kensington hostess and wife of a barrister, and writes wonderful letters. Her letters, including her letters of direction, are just a joy to read. But after the war, she says that she fell apart spiritually. Again, we don't have any details, but she sort of, in the course of immersion, she goes into spiritual direction with Friedrich von Hugel, who was a well-known Catholic modernist student of mysticism. It was only maybe 2.5 years that she worked with him, but he was a profound influence on her life. And he helped her to really find a place. She kind of slid back into a back pew in an Anglican church and, re-embraced the kind of social Anglicanism she was raised in after really considering becoming a Catholic. But she couldn't become a Catholic because of had been a papal decree against modernism, and she couldn't stomach that. And her conventional British husband could not abide the thought of his wife being in conversation with a confessor. So it was off the table, basically. But that's also often how vocation works, right? The path that's closed to us is also something that tells us about the path we're on. And von Hugel encouraged her into her own tradition. He also encouraged her to experience Christ in a way that she hadn't before. And she was always, I would say, she was always a spirit-centered person, in terms of, if you think about, I think one of the things you see in Underhill is that people have different paths to the holy, and the Trinity gives us a couple of those different paths, right? Some people start with God as parent, some people have a really strong relationship with Jesus, and some people are really drawn by the Spirit, but there's a kind of integration of that happens in the mature Christian path. So then she begins, and then she starts offering retreats. And this was a huge step for her, because even though she was widely published, she was a very shy person. So the idea of speaking, she could write letters to people, but the idea of giving public retreats was she said it felt like she was stepping off a cliff. But her retreats are, I think, my favorite things. She would basically, she had terrible asthma, and she actually died of asthma ultimately, of complications from asthma. But so she was always working around health issues. But every year she would write a retreat, and she would give it in a couple of different places and then publish it as a little book. So from the 20s and 30s, we have this whole series of beautiful retreats on different themes. I think my favorite is one called the School of Charity, which is meditations on, of all things, the Nicene Creed. Absolutely brings to life the mystery of the incarnation and all what we've been talking about embodied life. And presents that as kind of the core of a sacramental Christian life. And she's also all about living into our calling. So she talks, well, as you say, the Richard Rohr of her day. I mean, she gave a radio address in 1936, which has been published as a book called The Spiritual Life. Very accessible, addressed to a whole public audience. And she uses sort of three parts of the path. She says that the spiritual life involves adoration, followed by, so we start with just, and then communion, growing into a relationship with God, and then cooperation with God, carrying out in the world God's desire for the world.
Yes.
This lands her up finally being a pacifist, which, if you think about England in 1939, being a pacifist basically loses you all your public credibility. And so that, I think, was the way of the cross for her ultimately. I mean, she had certainly people who gathered around and agreed with her. She was also very committed to intercessory prayer in a way, although she said she wasn't good at praying for people, but she was very involved. She was involved in a kind of worldwide invisible prayer group called the Spiritual Entente that was started by a Franciscan in Italy, a woman named Sorella Maria. Sorella Maria keeps turning up. I don't know if anybody's done much work on her, but the Spiritual Entente were people who were praying for peace all through the 20s and 30s in Europe. And they had an informal rule of life. And actually, one of the elements of that rule of life was that you had to commit to participating in whatever your tradition was. So I think that was part of the impetus for her deciding to be an Anglican. So that inner life that does something to the world, that's also Richard Rohr, right? That's that sense that the contemplative heart is what is going to save us all.
Yeah, and what leads to that kind of compassionate action in the world around us. Yeah, we have just a couple minutes left. I'm so excited for your upcoming class on Evelyn in the Women Mystic School. For anybody who hasn't joined us yet, the Women Mystic School is available at womenmystics.org, and we've been having such a delightful time just each month on a different female mystic, having a masterclass with wonderful teachers and speakers, experts from around the world. And Evelyn just... I just am tickled by her writing. Like you talked about before, how you love words, and you can tell Evelyn does too. She just has the way she turns a phrase. I mean, she kind of reminds me of the Inklings, like a C.S. Lewis, a G.K. Chesterton, Belloc. Like they just had such a marvelous way of packaging ideas that, I don't know, you almost reach the end of a sentence and you're like, like you're like, I don't know if I should laugh or I have to think about that for a minute, but it's just delightful. Yeah. So I'm very excited to hear more about her, maybe, hear a little of her writings, but anybody who's in the Women Mystic School will also have the quotes packet that we've put together. So people can at least read some excerpts from her. But if people want to learn, Kathy, more about you, your work, your poetry, where should they go?
I have a website, KathleenStaudtPoet.com. So I think that's probably, I try to keep it more or less up to date in terms of what I'm doing. If you want to know more about Evelyn Underhill, the evelynunderhill.org is the website of the Evelyn Underhill Association, and we publish a yearly newsletter. Actually, the new one will be coming out probably in the next month or so. And we have the annual Quiet Day. That our leader next June we're very excited, will be the theologian Sarah Coakley.
Oh.
And we've had wonderful people leading those retreats. So and you can get on our mailing list and find out all about that on our website. So I think that's, and I will there will be news on my website when my next book of poems comes out. I'll be glad to let people know about that.
Veritas, we'll be keeping an eye out for that.
Right.
Well, beautiful. Well, this has been a delightful conversation. I so appreciate you taking time to share with us today some of your story and the world of poetry and the sacramental vision of the world. Is there any word of wisdom or piece of insight that you would like to leave with our audience?
Just that I think what Underhill says, I think, is just so true, that the experience of the great mystics doesn't differ that much from the experience available to all of us. She said it differs in degree and not in kind. So that's a thing I think I've kept in mind all the way through the Women Mystics School, and I think that she puts that very well.
Yes, beautiful, that it's accessible to all of us. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Kathy, and thank you all for listening in, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you for having me.